Hi, I'm Mira Levinson, a professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and one of the co-hosts of this special series discussing normative case studies. Today, we're going to be discussing walling out or welcoming in, a normative case study that was written with me and two teachers who were wrestling with these issues as teachers, and we're really excited to share it and talk with you about it today, as this has been actually one of our fairly powerful case studies over the past few years. I'm joined by four outstanding people to help think through this case. Margaret Blatchley is a psychoeducational specialist at the Center for Emotionally Responsive Practice at Bank Street College. I shouldn't say this, but one of my favorite educational institutions of all time, and has also been an advisor and instructor in the early childhood special education and bilingual programs at the Bank Street Graduate School of Education. Before joining the faculty there, she spent 11 years teaching pre-kindergarten and kindergarten in dual language and inclusion settings, which is 11 years more than I think I could do. And so I'm thrilled to have her here. Our second conversation partner is Leslie Boggs, who is the 56th president of the National Parent-Teacher Association, the nation's oldest and largest volunteer child advocacy association. She's spent decades advocating for educators, parents, and children in Texas and New Mexico and on the national stage. And she currently serves as a leadership coach and the president of Carol Boggs Consulting. Third is actually the principal of my children's old school, and a former collaborator of mine when she was a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education some years ago. So Carolina Brito is the principal of the Rafael Hernandez Dual Language K-8 school in the Boston Public Schools. Her specialty is in coaching teachers to innovate, collaborate, and execute on excellent equity-driven bilingual classroom instruction. And she was recently named Principal of the Year by the nonprofit association Playworks for her commitment to play and physical activity in schools. And then finally, I'm really thrilled to be getting back in touch with Jay Green, who figured out that we sort of knew each other probably 25 or 30 years ago. And I'm really excited that he's able to join us as a fourth conversation partner. He's a senior research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where his work focuses on the cultural, civic, and economic implications of how education systems are designed and implemented. He has authored or edited 4 books, including the best-selling Education Myths. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, he was a professor and department chair at the University of Arkansas. So a really terrific group here to help us talk about walling off or welcoming in. And I'm going to assume that you have watched the case or read it. And so we're going to dive right in with the first question about the dilemmas in this case. And just to start with, to define a dilemma, when we use the word dilemma, what we're talking about is a choice in which there's no one right answer, and it's hard or even impossible to realize all important values and principles at once. And although the linguists among you may think, well, a dilemma suggests that there's like some, binary division, we think of actually like a number of dilemmas and lots of different ways to understand them. So there's nothing binary about this. So let me actually kick this off, Carolina, with you, if you don't mind. Just can you talk us through one or two of the dilemmas that you see in this case and for whom you think they're dilemmas?
Happy to do that. Okay, so as a fellow principal, I think the first dilemma that surfaced to my mind immediately are sort of what are the obligations of the school vis-a-vis running an inclusive, politically divided but inclusive school environment. And so then thinking at the level of what is this principal's responsibility in moderating this conversation? Because I think the position that this principal has taken is I see your side and I see your side. And there's no decisions made for anybody anywhere. So they're taking the easy way out around, in my personal opinion, I won't go in there. I'm gonna stop right there. That's dilemma number 1. What do I do? Number 2, I think there's this pedagogical dilemma at the heart of things, or the fantastic little story about Maestra Elena, who's sitting there very cleverly narrating a way out of this building the wall thing in the middle of the classroom, where like her dilemma is, how do I like hear what this child is saying and still communicate an ethic of care for all of the humans present in the room. I think that's, and then when confronted by another parent who says, by the virtue of the fact that you responded that our job can't be taken away from us, you're already taking a political stance. So I think there's a dilemma around care, and does care mean exclusion of someone else's thinking or like political persuasion, or their parents' political persuasion, to be honest. I think those two are like at the heart of the thing for me. But I'd be curious to hear what other people surfaced.
I also went first to the principal and the teachers. Um, Having been a teacher myself, having tried thoughtfully to teach kids to care, and trying to now teach teachers to teach kids to care, um, I was taken pretty deeply and pretty quickly into the dilemma of um, creating an environment of care with, like Carolina said, with very different perspectives coming from homes of very young children and also of older children. Um, I see the dilemma of preaching inclusion and being told that someone is being excluded. So Colin's father in the seventh grade, it sees or is using the language that his child is being excluded. And so the dilemma here, I think, for everybody, myself included, was to step away from what I feel is right and to step back and to see a larger picture of what's really happening. And I have thoughts about the classroom teacher in the first grade that I won't get into now, but I could see her dilemma of thinking she did the right thing in the moment and then being called on saying, actually, what you did wasn't fully inclusive because you should be celebrating the children who built the wall for their innovation. And so, this, perhaps the reason I said coming on, I was nervous, was because this was very close to my own heart. These were situations I could see myself in. And I'm excited to be in conversation about them, and also thinking this is a growing space for anyone to think about a hypothetical, because this will be, if it hasn't been already for all of us, this will be something that we encounter in our work with educators. I also thought a little bit about the social emotional coordinator and his dilemma of um, bringing kids together in a caring space and trying to help them see each other's perspective. He, of all the folks in the case study, seems to be the least reactive about his own feelings about what either party is saying. Um, but perhaps there's a dilemma there of having a feeling about how it should be, and not really feeling professionally like he can take a stance. So the dilemmas for me were about taking a stance or not taking a stance, and what does it mean when you take a stance?
As I listened to everyone that spoke previously, I agree with what they have to say. The problem is that no one is making a decision. And coming from a parent organization that certainly supports both teachers and parents, is what we're seeing here is that parents become very judgmental whenever it becomes their child and what they're doing. And so we have to be very much aware of where parents are coming from, that unless we set expectations of what to do, then I don't think there's going to be any decision that's going to be made in this particular situation.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. Jay, what's on your mind?
Sure. Well, challenge of going last is everyone else has already said such good things that they echo what I was thinking. I mean, the only thing that I could add is that that the dilemma I was focused on is that a school has an obligation to teach values. It does inevitably teach values, but that there are some shared values in the community of people in the school, but there are also some differences that are important. And so how the school and the families involved in the school adjudicate those differences while still pursuing their shared values seems very a very difficult task for everyone involved, from the students to the teachers to the parents to the principal. And one other thing I was thinking about is whether if the facts were changed so that the dynamic of the situation were the same, but it were a different scenario, might the actors involved have different feelings about it and have different preferences, at least initially? And might we have different feelings about it and different preferences? That was another thing that came to mind while watching the video.
Can you play that out a little bit more? I think we can probably each imagine or guess what you mean, but I'm curious, like we might imagine different things.
Sure. So I'm in this instance, there's a free speech concern that Colin's father has. And then there's a harassment concern that Marquise's mother has. And if the substance was not about a child endorsing Trump and repeating things favorable about Trump's policies and perhaps enacting play in school that somehow represented those policies, but instead were some of the things that might be free speech concerns that Marquise might have, and be harassment or bullying concerns that Colin and his father might have, then we could easily imagine the situation just being reversed. But it's the same basic dynamic, even if we alter the substance of the facts.
Right. So yes, Gregory brings up this question about, say, how the teachers and the students and the principal might respond if, say, there was a celebration of Second Amendment rights as compared to celebrations of other rights. Yes, you could imagine, say, let me know, Jay, if this is the correct way of interpreting what you're saying, but this case existing where you have children, say, play acting a Black Lives Matter protest, in which there is not only advocacy in favor of Black Lives Mattering, but concerns about and claims made about it, the oppressiveness of police, or the need to defund the police, or so and so forth, and a child who is feeling excluded as the child of a police officer, or and where, is that the right way of sort of thinking through what you're proposing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That there are many political activities that occur in school by students, or political expressions by students, that could be bothersome to Colin and his family, just as there are things that Colin might say that could be bothersome to Marquise and Marquise's family.
I'd love to jump in on this one, because I'll be really honest with you, like, the one that I was like, I think I got a third dilemma here, but even I'm parsing it out through my brain how to say this, right? But like, as a Latina, the teacher's name is Morales. For the love of God, like, you've got kids building a wall in the middle of the room. I don't know where Morales is from, but Elena Morales, like, come on. Like, there's also if this is a person that identifies as Latina, then there is the question of, how does this, like, I have to separate how I respond to this professionally, but as a human being, like, this is the thing that teachers in the pandemic have had to deal with day in and day out. Like, my humanity versus my job has now sometimes become like an unbearable load to lift, right? So there is that element of the dilemma, and the reason that like it took so long to want to articulate it is because there's this, like, rightfully so, there's a level of like, wait, I'm the adult in the room. There's also a different imbalance of power here. Like, I'm the grown up, they're the kids. Like, I gotta hold it together. But there's also the sense of when this thing happens, you cannot help but think of, and I will speak from the I perspective on this one as a person of color, but like I can't help but think of my family or like my loved ones or the other children in the room who are also like Latino, for whom many Americans conflate all of us together as Mexican, right? So to me, there's also this thing that I have like constantly had to narrate as a school leader too, of like, how does yourself affect how you have to respond personally and professionally to what you're seeing students enact in a classroom? Because there is a remove of power there that we have to acknowledge. Like, they're little people, right? At the same time, what the little people are bringing into the space is what the big people assume about you as a person too, right? Like that level of the dilemma of like, how do I respond to this professionally when the family that I am also responsible to responding to holds that position, and it feels like a threat to my person. And that is a very specific, like it took me actually a couple minutes to articulate that, because it's a very specific bind for educators of color in this particular political climate too.
Let me pose one or two more questions quickly, and then we'll move on. One is this question of little people, as Carolina puts it, is really important. We have little people of different ages, right? And one of the dilemmas that comes up for me in reading this case is questions about developmental readiness and appropriateness of different kinds of responses, right? So there's the response that Elena has to her 6-year-olds that Susie is thrilled by, and then is cautioned by Rob, wait, you teach 7th graders, right? Like, it's not so clear that that's the same kind of response that you should be giving to a 7th grader. And I'm curious if there are dilemmas around this sort of developmental readiness question that arose for any of you.
I will say that development is a main focus of the work that I think about in emotionally responsive practice. We actually always bring people back to very early development. We actually say, if you're teaching 6th grade, let's talk about infancy, toddlerhood, and 3-year-olds. And then we'll go back to talking about 6th grade, because so many of the developmental milestones that happen socially and emotionally and relationally for us are rooted in our very early experiences. And when under pressure, we see them circling back. And any of us can think of casual moments where, in the presence of our parents, we suddenly didn't want to do our own laundry, for example, when we've been independent for years. And that's a kind of funny way to say that when an older kid gets in an adverse situation, some of the feelings from earlier childhood surface. And when an adult gets in an adverse situation, some of those feelings from earlier childhood surface, and a younger self responds or can respond. And it's a skill that many of us work on with therapists, to hear and acknowledge that younger self, and then come to a more grounded perspective of the older self that we're constantly trying to become. And I bring that up because I'm thinking about the fundamentals and the simplicity of what happens when children are very young, feeding what they're able to encounter simply on a more sophisticated level as they get older. The trouble is, it's very difficult to deeply train so many teachers who are with young children daily. But as an early childhood teacher, I did feel that there were things that could be brought up on the most basic of levels, and that children did have the capacity for understanding if you didn't get too heady. And the seventh graders can get into policy analysis, they can get into how systems work. The younger children need to see that an adult is reflecting their reality.
Thanks. So this is a fascinating set of dilemmas that you all have raised. Let me say back to you in slightly different form some of the big themes that I've heard you all raise. And then I want to dig into a couple of them as we think about why we're facing these dilemmas. So, one set of dilemmas that a bunch of you brought up actually was differences, the dilemma of navigating differences in how we understand the same value. So Carolina started us off with this in thinking about care, and what and how, say, Elena shows an ethic of care for every student in the room. And then, in fact, later on, Carolina also brought up, and how does Elena basically engage in an ethic of care for herself, too, right? And what does care mean in a school when there's disagreement about what care entails and what kinds of care should be shown to whom in what ways, right? And I felt as if each of you actually brought up the question about the meaning of care. And so I want to come back to that. There was a second set of dilemmas that you all brought up around just how to navigate, right, a politically divided school environment. And there were some practical dilemmas of what do you do when you face these political divisions as a teacher, as a principal, as a parent, as a student. In fact, we haven't quite dug into the students' dilemmas that they face, but I think they're there as well, right? There were also questions of leadership that you brought up. Who is it? Who should be defining what is in versus out in a politically divided environment, right? What kind of leadership should the principal be showing? What kind of leadership should the teachers be showing? What kind of leadership should the parents be showing? And who should be contesting it versus just saying, okay, here's some clarity about it, right? And then actually there were the dilemmas that we got into around, well, what should be treated as acceptable, right? So there was a question about navigating a politically divided community, about who should be exercising leadership in setting the parameters of the politically divided community, and then the questions that I think Jay took us in the most of, well, what should those parameters be, in fact, right? Even if we agree the principal should be setting them, or they should be set collectively by the principal and the teachers and the parents and the students together, whatever it is. What are those parameters, right? And how do we decide what's in and out? So that was another big set of questions that I think you all were raising. And then I think a third set of questions that was coming up was around identity, right? So I had specifically asked you all the question about identity with respect to race and ethnicity. But also there was the identity, say, that Leslie brought up, of the identity of a parent when we see our child who's impacted, and kind of how we go into mama bear or papa bear mode, right? And trying to protect our child. And then Carolina brought up the question of, say, the teachers' racialized and ethnic identity in relation to the play of the children in her classroom, and how she also believes that those child's parents or family members may be viewing her, etc. Right? There are questions around the identities that are present within the school, as Jay reminded us, versus the identities that are present in the broader community, and how, say, power and hierarchies play out in these various settings. And there's a really important point that Margaret brought in around developmental identity, and how, in fact, our identities aren't even fixed, and our developmental stages aren't even necessarily fixed, particularly at times of conflict, right? And how we may regress, or how we may sort of seek back sort of those older or younger. So there's sort of more innate reactions when we feel ourselves to be challenged or unsettled. So that was another set of dilemmas that I heard. And then I would love to hear from you to think about some of these sort of values tensions, whether it's within one value, like this conception of care, or if it's about thinking across these different values of, say, respecting identity, respecting free speech, respecting membership, etc.
So taking back my own story to being a young teacher and being in teacher training school at Bank Street College, I was very taken up with the ideas of John Dewey that, and it was mentioned in the script, isn't public education preparing citizens for democracy? Isn't that the baseline that we should be working for? And I remember feeling very inspired by this and thinking, my pre-K classrooms and my kindergarten classrooms, we did a lot of voting, and we talked a lot about what it meant to vote, and we talked about making sure they could go with a grown-up to vote. On election day, people vote, and that's part of how we decide things that are right for all people. And I think that in some ways I was young, that, educating for democracy is not only voting. And I'm beginning to question what that looks like as my own understanding of democracy in today's political climate feels sometimes tenuous and fragile and idealistic and hopeful, as well as many times I'm fearful that what I believed democracy was is what is actually happening and playing out in our governments. So I wanted to contextualize that idea of, isn't a school a place where a public school is a place to educate citizens of a democracy? So what does that mean, and how does that affect what should be done? And my perspective as a practitioner right now over the past decade has come a long way to a very strong belief in the power of story and the power of interconnection and the power of people coming to see each other as whole people and really being able to see somebody else's child as a whole child, even when that person's child looks different than their own, or sounds different than their own, or dresses different than their own. And I think it's one of the hardest things for parents to do, is to come to that place. And I think some teachers also struggle with it. So I am an idealist. I do believe in the theory of democracy. I do believe that it's a powerful structure that certainly wasn't gotten right by the founding fathers in their context, but that is definitely something that we can build on with with expanding our perspectives of who belongs and what that means. And that's all a sort of long-winded preface to saying that I think what needs to happen is growing community. What should be done? Where are the forums for people to get to know each other before they put down their stances? And what I saw happening in this video is what I see happening when I talk to my father-in-law. Puts out a provocative question, my buttons are pushed, I get on my stance, he digs in his heels, and we leave feeling like, oh, I'm so frustrated because this person is just can't see and refuses to see. And perhaps he feels the same about me. I heard my own 8th grader confronting their grandfather about LGBTQI rights on Pride Day and saying, Grandpa, I suggest you go on YouTube and listen to some stories of some kids. I really think it's going to expand your perspective. And I felt so proud of my own kid, and also a little bit hopeful, but also reminded of the power of sharing story. And a lot of what we do in our work is allow people to find their commonalities, um, and then relook at their stances when they see each other as a fellow parent, as a fellow journeyer, as a fellow immigrant, as a fellow, um, parent of a toddler, of an adolescent, as a fellow hoper and dreamer. And I just wonder if this particular committee had done that kind of work together before they started trying to solve the problems, maybe they would be able to have more nuances in how they interpret the situations. Maybe Colin's father could let go of his defensiveness a little bit.
So what do you think should be done by whom and why?
I mean, I'm a practical kind of problem solving person, so like you said before, I was just jumping to like, well, what's the policy supposed to be, and who should decide it, which I think you also raised, Mara, and it seems to me that there are kind of two types of solutions, and it might depend on the type of school you have. But that if people choose a school somehow, are part of a voluntary community, then the school could be in a different kind of position to assert its values and its priorities collectively and impose those, and say, this is, as part of our community, this is how we do things in our school. And if you don't agree with that, you don't have to be part of that voluntary community. But there are also, schools are also involuntary communities, and I think one of the participants, maybe it was Colin's dad, said, this is mandatory schooling, right? The kids have to be there. And to the extent that these are not really voluntary communities, but are compelled communities, then the school has to behave differently and can't be as forceful in saying, these are our values, this is what we're going to enforce. And instead, I think they have to focus instead on postures of neutrality. That is, as best they can, come up with policies that would be considered neutral or fair to all parties if situations were reversed, which is why I was interested in thinking about if the facts were changed, might everyone feel differently? And then, so if it's a forced community, they would have to come up with neutral policies where, regardless of the particular facts, everyone would feel equally aggrieved or comforted, even if the situation were changed. So that was my thought of two different paths to solving this depending upon the type of school.
Thanks, Jay. Leslie?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I really, probably for me, the best way to do this is a collaboration between parents and teachers about setting some values and discussing their values and having diversity of thought and understanding that everyone's to be respected in the room. And then have a separate discussion with your students, because they also need to give their thoughts about their values and what they think about them, and how it's important for us to look at those values of both sets. So then getting everybody back together and seeing probably the difference between what students are saying and what parents and teachers are saying. It may be totally different, it may be the same, but this way you get complete buy-in.
And do you see this school culture committee as exemplifying that what you're calling for? These are parents and teachers getting together and discussing their values, or is it failing to exemplify that in some way?
Well, and so there was lots of questions that I had about the culture committee, like, are they appointed by the principal, or are they elected by the parents? How do these individuals get on this committee? And I think that's probably the core question that I have. If they've been appointed by the principal, that usually does not go over well with most of the majority of parents. They want to know that they had the opportunity to be included as well. And probably, I'm not sure how it goes with teachers, but I've seen it both ways. So it's just one of those committees that if they represent the parents that are in that school, I'll use parents, then I think they probably are doing their best. I don't think they're I don't think they're answering the baseline of what the school needs. I think they discuss a lot, talk about it a lot, but I don't see any decisions being made.
Thanks, Leslie. Margaret.
It isn't exactly an answer, a solution, but I believe that building in places and times where the goal is making connections. And I brought this little pack of cards called Just One Story. Um, More Than One Story, it's called. And it has questions in English and Spanish where people can just talk to each other. What was a long journey you made? And I have done this a little bit in parenting groups at my child's school, and it didn't solve the problems of the world, but those moments were very rich for humanizing people with a very different background than myself. So that's the goal, and I think there are ways to get there.
So the first thing on my mind, Mira, is that you basically gave us an impossible case study because you're asking us to solve, like, in the micro, the macro systems of everything. So that was slick. Good job. And nice try. Um, I think I have two thoughts. One is that, Margaret, what you were mentioning rings absolutely true to me, that, like, I think if our nation has any hope, it's in the power of the encounter with the other. The other as then becoming part of, like, that other has to become part of your ecosystem and, like, understand mutual humanity in order for us to move forward. I recognize the universal truth of that statement and at the same time grapple with some, like, really hard facts at school, right? So on a systems level, like on a principally level, I think, Leslie, you were mentioning, like, damn, someone's got to make a decision over here because we're getting nowhere. Like, it is true. In fact, like, I think the reason I am brave enough to propose a set of values that are very absolute in terms of bias-based conduct and commentary, albeit, like, the consequences for bias-based conduct and commentary in K1 is super different from, like, 8th grade, right? Like, the reason I am comfortable putting a stake in the ground is because on a systems level, like, the Office of Equity and BPS is very, very clear on the policy end of, like, what constitutes an equity violation in Boston, right? So that's, like, allegations of bias-based conduct based on race, color, disability, sex, gender identity, like, you name the rainbow of identity spectrums. There's, like, a list of things that you just can't do. And in fact, like, this classroom interaction with, like, a kid saying, like, keep out the Mexicans, you could actually argue is an equity violation, and the agency there is in, like, the educational consequence or response to the commentary. So, like, in my system, there's a very black and white answer to this. I think that undermines the complexity of this situation, though. Like, so I don't actually want to answer it that way, but although, like, practically speaking, there is an answer where I work. Outside of where I work, I think the things that make me that, like, I really struggle with are that even within this building, like, we have a significant margin, like 90% of us are Latino, staff and families and students, right? And within a majority people of color community, there is also a significant political divide because, you know, like, Latino folks are not monolithic. So the most frequent complaints that I get about scenarios such as this, so very clear example, I made the decision that the whole school was going to watch, like, the inauguration. I made the decision that we were going to, like, do some work on how we use gendered language in Spanish, like Latines as opposed to Latinx or Latino, Latinas, right? I made some decisions around, like, X, Y, and Z, and the flood of calls I got were not from the progressive white JP parents. The flood of calls I got about kids being invited to speak about gender identity, for example, were all from Latino folks who had sent their kids here for generations, right? Like, the people who built the school were calling me to be like, the hell is this? And so I think there is a really, to your point earlier, Jay, like, if you change the cast here, the conversation's very interesting because I've had to hold the equity violation stuff to the families of color that the equity violation stuff was meant to protect. That's a layer of some stuff that we then have to, as a school name, like, listen, this might have been this way in your day, but like, here are the protected categories that we hold as a district and a state around like equal rights for X, Y, and Z categories of people. And I will say, like, I don't mean to reduce this to the practicality of things, but in some ways, like, I have to operate, right? Like, I run a school. There are things that, like, legislatively do make a big difference in how you navigate that level of complexity. And that I imagine in other places then complicate it if the legislative pieces are in contradiction with the school leader or with this family pack of humans. And I have found that the contradictions that play out here at school, then, like, I'm not, Mira, this is not answering the question of, like, what do we do? But, like, I just want you to, I'm adding to the complexity of why this is a little crazy. It's because I then end up in these very interesting situations where I have white families barking at Latino families for not being sufficiently progressive. And so the racial divide that opens is actually around like issues that culturally do not hold the same water with everyone. And so intersectionality in these conversations then becomes like a really big deal. And like your earlier intuition, Jay, that this thing is actually really complicated by caste is absolutely true. And I think I find myself in a very difficult situation when our equity policies are being wielded to silence like some Latino families who have very strong opinions about this. And then we have to come to the school was built by families, like Puerto Rican families built this house, right? And these are the families who are saying like, I don't like this JP liberalism with all these crazy white people with all these thoughts. And then you have the equity policy in between. So I think there's a lot of, I'll speak for my, like I make no claims to generally what everybody should do. Where I am sitting, I keep going back to the thing that you were talking about, Margaret, in that we don't know the other yet in this school community for us to be able to understand, like my Latino families to be able to sit down with kids who are like asking to be referred to as he or she in the 4th grade and in K1, and like the ability to like come to terms with each other as people, I think lies at the heart of our ability to function as a school. And in the meantime, I keep having to come back to the policy. So I think it's like a both and that makes it very, very tricky. Because a sense of community, I think, breaks down when there are extraordinary circumstances that no amount of dialogue would fix. And I find that like stumbling block frequently in the work. I'll pause there.
Thank you. This is really helpful. And this actually brings me back to where Jay started us off, which was the question of how capacious a community we should have in a school. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that in light of what Margaret was articulating as the civic aim of schools to help equip us for a democracy. So Jay set up this potential sort of 2 choices. One is we can self-segregate into communities of shared civic values. And the other is that we come up with some potentially neutral modus vivendi, right, that works regardless of the substantive stance one takes. I'm going to focus on this question of isolating into communities of shared civic values. And because I worry that if we do that, then we will not actually prepare ourselves to function in a democracy in which, Margaret, your child um, is trying to have a real conversation with their grandfather. And there's presumably huge love between them, and the question, and then there's the question about what does your child do when they're trying to have a conversation with somebody they don't know, and vice versa. So I'm curious, uh, Jay. I know that you have actually favored school choice in a lot of your work, in part because of the ability of families to create the kind of shared spaces that they want to. But given what Margaret is challenging us with the sort of the democratic mission of schools, and what Carolina is challenging us with, which is that even among families who might generally embrace a certain, form of generic liberalism, if not progressivism, that we still see a lot of internal division when we start getting to these nitty gritty. Do you think we should be isolating in communities of shared values, or do you think we should be pursuing neutrality, whatever that means, or something else?
So I think that actually uh, we have sorted ourselves now and for all of our history and likely for our future, at least to some extent. It's just a question of the magnitude of the sorting, right? So people choose to live to some extent in different places, and so what Carolina sees as policy of her school is the policy of her school, given that it's in Boston, in Massachusetts, and if it were somewhere else, it could very well be different. Either the policies themselves would be different, or the different trade-offs that are perceived between competing policies. And I imagine that there are also competing policies that have to do with free speech and so on that also apply even in Boston. But that, how it is that these trade-offs have been adjudicated are a reflection of local priorities, and those local priorities are in part because we have sorted. So we're always sorting. It's a big country and a diverse country, and we've always sorted ourselves to some extent based on some shared values and priorities. And you're also right in wondering that even when we do sort, of course, anytime you get people together, there will be differences, and that they will have to sort them out somehow. But let me also just push back slightly on the claim that the primary mission of schooling is preparation for democracy. I think that might be a mission, and again, that's a value. But there are other priorities. We might, instead of thinking of schools as preparation for democracy, we might think of them as extensions of family. That is, that they are part of parenting. They're really just the thing that we do to raise our children, and that for actually much of human history, families have just educated their children either themselves or with people that they have specifically hired or selected. And so the idea that they would go to a politically created organization is a modern and unusual thing in human history. So I think there's no avoiding sorting, and then really it's just a matter of what kind of sorting do we think is appropriate, and how do we balance that off of legitimate concerns about our understanding and getting along with a broader community. I actually think that overall, believe it or not, we work these things out pretty well. It's messy, uncomfortable, and lots of fighting. But that, actually it's kind of an impressive thing in this country that we somehow, have 350 million people with very diverse views, and yet the country actually still works. Not as well as everyone would like, and not in the ways that everyone would like, but the country runs. And so I think we have reasons to be optimistic that we're not somehow sorting in a way that the whole place is the wheels are coming off or something like that.
Leslie, I'd love to hear your thoughts, in part because we are seeing parents right now organize ideologically in a way that has been less true in the past. So on the right, we have thousands now of Moms for Liberty chapters. On the left, sort of earlier, you had various parents who were sort of affiliating themselves with, say, Diane Ravitch and her latest incarnation, the sort of Parents for Public Schools. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but there are a few sort of left-leaning public school-oriented parent groups, but we are seeing a lot more ideological sorting, and then also parents who are voicing pretty strong political positions, say in school board meetings. I don't know how much it's making its way into PTA meetings, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Oh, it's making its way into our meetings, trust me. But I think probably you're correct that parents are looking for a safe place so they can discuss their values and feel safe about discussing those values. Do I think it's wise that there's so many that are going and splitting off? I don't. That's my personal view. I think that's why our country is having the issues that we are with our political system, is because we all decided we're just going to fight each other. We're not going to find a common ground. So I think that's part of the problem. But everyone's looking for a place that they feel safe and respected. I just don't think sorting everybody out is an answer. I don't. I'm one that believes that as democracy is a ground of where we are in this nation, we should all look at it and try to understand why it was based on democracy and why we are a democracy, and discuss that with our students more often than we do now. And I think having that diverse thought and understanding and respecting what they're saying will help us in the long run to have a better nation. So short answer is I'm not for the sorting, but I understand it's going on, but really hope that our students are going to come out better than what we've seen in the past.
Just a really quick thought. I think just hearing what Jay and Leslie are saying, we can't afford to sort. Like, by no means a stretch of the imagination would my school survive if we were sorting, for two reasons. One, actually, some of those JP progressive white parents are incredible.
And let me just say, JP stands for Jamaica Plain, which is a neighborhood of Boston that is a particularly progressive neighborhood. All right, sorry, back to your shorthand.
So just quick little history lesson, 1973, we opened doors. We actually came out of the Garrity desegregation order. We were like the only school that is still standing and functioning positively as a result of a desegregation order, right? So the premise upon which we exist relies on our ability to stand in a district where like dual language immersion is dual language immersion. The whole premise of the project is that it's like a radical democratization thing where like folks who are monolingual Spanish speaking and folks who are monolingual English speaking come to learn both languages. That is the entire premise. And everyone graduates bicultural, biliterate, and bilingual. So sorting is not an option in like the mission of the school, and in fact like would be an utter failure on our end in this pocket. I hear what Jay's saying though, like we've all sorted by virtue of where we pay taxes and where we decided to go vote, and there's stuff we didn't even realize that we differed on until we had to coexist though. And every time I hear a Latino family telling me like, listen, I'm gonna send my kid to Catholic school because I can't deal with this talk about gender no more. It breaks my heart because every Latino family we lose means that we as a solidarity, like a people, we as a people lose our presence in the city of Boston. Because like my people have built this place politically. We are keeping it alive politically and financially by like seats filled equals ability to hold a school, right? So losing humans of both political leanings or of both ethnic strands or races, like all of this, we have to make it work. or the school doesn't exist. So like I feel like a very deep urgency in trying to respond, and not like being perfect at it. Like I don't really have an answer for y'all, but I feel the urgency in like making it work through the power of what it means to encounter one another, right? So like, so very small, very simple things, but like we offer ESL classes for families and Spanish learning classes for families because we're like really nervous about the fact that if folks don't literally talk to each other, we cannot politically organize for what the children need. And that in it, like, you know, feel the way you want to feel about this, that, and the third, but ultimately I need them to believe in an ideal and a value system and like a dream for their children that supersedes their individual differences. And so you got to sell a dream, and the dream's got to be real good, or we can't leave that stuff at the table. And I think that's the, like, what do we appeal to that is greater than ourselves? I won't lie to you, like, Jay, I used to be in a Catholic school. Like, I used to lead in a Catholic school. It was very easy for me to say, like, we are all children of the one family of God. In a secular context, what is it that we all hold? What's the purpose of school? I actually think for us, we wouldn't answer democracy. We would answer that each human being that steps into this is allowed to become excellent because of who they are. Period. So like, if you're bilingual, you get to be extraordinary because you are bilingual, not despite the fact that you are bilingual, right? Like, I think there's this urgency on my end, and I'll like conclude here. You gotta make it work, and you gotta make people believe that there's something bigger here that's worth sacrificing something, like a la social contract. But that's the rub.
Thank you. There's so much more to say, but I know that at least Carolina has a hard stop at 4, and the rest of us have things to do too. So I have 2 final questions that I want to get a final thought about from each of you. How did working through these issues with a case study compare to other ways in which you've thought through them? And what do you hope others listening to this conversation will continue thinking about?
I think hearing different folks out on, like, I actually am especially struck by, Margaret, your comment on like community is around encounter, like they're the little things. It made me think of the 5,000 things that I've dropped the ball on that I could have done better to build community and humanity between like the humans involved who are so different. So I really appreciate that. And I'm walking away thinking about hoping that when other folks look at this case study, I actually do find it super relevant to get to the concreteness of like context that you're operating in and playing with what Jay was talking about. Like, okay, but like, what if it's a different issue, right? So what if they're enacting the Black Lives Matter protest, right? So like, because this is a very specific thing that we're talking about, this like the blocks, like my brain went to an automatic, very easy solution, but I would hope that in other dialogues that people would start parsing through what does a commitment to like anti-harassment mean from a different perspective. Because that's the thing that has been the hardest for me as a school leader in thinking about what happens when that family who heard the conversation in health class about X, Y, and Z, what happens when they feel harassed because it's contrary to their values, right? Like those have been the hardest moments for me to like adopt the opposite perspective. And so I think that's the hope I would have in like how other folks read this case. Same values applied to different scenarios and different like role switches.
I think it brought home to me about the diversity of thought in any given situation, depending on the teacher's perspective, the student's perspective, and then administration and how varying they can be, and the need for a solution to happen, not just conversation. So I think that was underscored for me. It was also underscored for me that my core belief is our children are the foundation of our nation. And I think it's critical that we really teach them diversity of thought. And so I think probably more conversations around what's going on in the classroom instead of somebody telling them something, then maybe getting them in a conversation. So, what do you think this happened? Why do you think this is? Just like Elena did. So, I really appreciated that as a really good role model.
So thinking about how the case study model is different than being a character in the story, for example, is just that it allows me the space, the mental space to go back, read people's words over again, think about what was happening in each moment, think about what's behind what's bubbling to the surface for each character. And but also to make it very, very much it's concrete. I say that in quotations because it's a random invented principle and teachers, but they become real characters. This becomes a real story. And I spoke earlier about the power of story. So I think the power of story as told through a case study allows us to prepare ourselves for what we are going to encounter in the real world with a little bit more distance and a little bit less reactivity. My hopes that somebody listening to this conversation um, will see the humanity in each dilemma and will really think about the value of carving out time to come together, to bring people together, to both facilitated and organic spaces of connection in the schools around children, um, to be both raising children and raising children within our particular democracy with an idea of hope, that the idea that children can grow up and become a politician or become an artisan or become a technician, that really is part of the values of a democracy. And so I do hope that people will go away thinking, where in my school community, from my classroom to my parent events to my teacher connection events, am I carving out the space for people to connect on the personal level to the extent that they can bring it back and apply to their practice?
So I think one of the things I had strengthened for me from this conversation, learned, was how there is not a single universal solution to these trade-offs. Schools are ultimately places that teach values. They're not merely providers of vocational or economically useful skills. They also develop us as human beings and as moral human beings. But we have legitimate differences about what it means to be a moral human being, and that there is no universal solution to what happens when we have disagreements about that. And I sympathize with all of the parties involved in this scenario with having to figure out a way to solve it, because ultimately the school has to figure out some way to move forward and function effectively as a school. So what I would hope people watching this take away then from all this, what I've taken away from it is that to the extent we can, I think it's preferable to decentralize these disagreements in a way that's sufficient to reduce the intensity of the disagreement, to allow the schools to function effectively. And this decentralization could be literally school choice, where people voluntarily associate in the school with some explicit shared values, or it could be decentralization to geographic community, neighborhoods, cities, regions, states, where there are more common values held within those geographic areas. And that also allows people to sort out these disagreements with lower intense conflict and allow the schools to function in a productive way. While I think none of these arrangements sacrifice fully the exposure of children or their parents or teachers or administration to diversity and disagreement. As I think we've clearly heard, even in a school in Boston that's 80% Latinx, where there might be a lot of commonality, there are still disagreements. There are always disagreements. And so the learning activity of being exposed to difference and learning how to navigate difference is something we don't have to add extra to make sure that students are exposed to it. They will get it plenty. But instead, I think our concern is just making sure the schools can function so that they have manageable disagreements. And I think a desirable way to do that is decentralization, either geographic or voluntary, or non-geographic voluntary.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you so much to all four of you, to Margaret and Jay and Leslie and Carolina, for a really stimulating conversation. I am so grateful to all four of you for sharing your views and for puzzling out loud with us about these issues.
Thanks to Dr. Mira Levinson, Sarah O'Brien, and the Ed Ethics team at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for working with us to create this special series. Thanks also to today's panelists, Margaret Blatchley, Leslie Boggs, Carolina Brito, and Jay Green. And thank you for watching this episode.
You can find separate links to the case video and the discussion video on our website, ethicalschools.org, and on Dr. Levinson's website, justiceinschools.org, where you can also find links to the other cases that Dr. Levinson and her team have created, as well as resources for leading your own discussions about these cases.
We welcome your feedback on this series. Email us and follow us on social media at Ethical Schools. This episode was produced by Hoot Owl Media.